We have a number of webinars going on. Please check back for other webinars that might be of interest to you. Finally, the materials, the PowerPoint I'm going to be showing you are going to be available. There's a link at the very bottom of the screen where you can get those materials, as well as any answers to questions that we don't have time to get to today, but if you've asked questions, we'll certainly try and answer those and put those up with the materials a bit later. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. This should be about a 10 or 15 minute presentations today, and then we'll kind of go from there. So we have some changes that are coming up with the sequence databases, and this is a first webinar. We have a few other announcements that have come out about this, but we're starting to try and do some outreach about these changes so that you have time to adjust to what's going to be happening. So the first thing I'll try and talk about is what's changing, what's going on, and the short answer to that question is that we're phasing out a kind of identifier called a GI number, and I'll talk more about what those are in a couple of minutes. That's the next topic, what they are, a little bit of a review of what kind of identifiers that we use for the sequence databases and why those changes are happening and when they'll happen. And then the fourth topic, perhaps the more interesting one, what's going to break? If you have a piece of software or a service, what will break as a result of these changes, what won't break? And we'll talk briefly about that, as well as some additional service changes that we anticipate that will be coming up in the next weeks and months that are related to these changes with GI numbers. So what is changing? So we are beginning to phase out the usage of the GI number, which has been a sequence identifier used in the sequence databases for many, many years. The one thing to remember about this is that existing GI numbers, records that already have a GI number, those GI numbers will remain indefinitely. All right, so we're not deleting GI numbers from data. They will be able to be used for retrieving those sequences that have them already. But the real issue is that NCBI will not be assigning GI numbers to all new sequences that are being submitted. And over time, it will eventually happen that we will not assign GI numbers at all anymore. That's going to be a gradual process, and it only will affect new sequences. What's happening soon in September is that we will no longer show GI numbers on flat file record views and FASTA record views by default. So those GI numbers simply will not be present in those data formats. The GI numbers will still be present in the data record, but will not be visible in the flat file and FASTA formats. In March of 2017, you will not be able to see flat file or FASTA formats with GI numbers at all. So beginning in September 2016, they will not be by default, but you will still be able to get these records with GI numbers in them, and we'll have more about that as we go along. But coming in March 2017, you won't be able to see the GI numbers at all. So you have about 7 months of leeway to prepare yourself for the fact that you will no longer be able to get the GI numbers out of flat files or FASTA. So I want to take a brief moment to show you the original announcement that came out about this in March of this year. There's a link to it here. What I'm going to do is just switch over to a web browser, to the article itself. This article is on the NCBI News page. It's the feature article on the NCBI News site, which is the www.ncbi.nlm.nih.gov/news. You can see it there. I'm not going to read through the whole article, but I do want to show you in the article there's a couple of examples that kind of make the point. So this is part of a typical nucleotide record in the new core database. What you'll see is the two identifiers that you see now, the GI number and the accession number. And you also see these for the protein product in the feature table down here, the accession number for the protein and the GI number for the protein. What will be happening is that those GI numbers simply will be gone. All right? They will not be shown in the records. You'll simply see the accession. You'll simply see the accession for the protein ID. There will not be a GI number present. A similar kind of thing will happen for the protein records. Again, right now in a protein record, you will see the accession number and the GI on the same line. In the future, the GI number will not be there. Similarly, in FASTA formatted records, currently the def line of the FASTA or the title line of the FASTA has a seq ID identifier at the beginning, which starts with GI, then a pipe, and then the GI number, and then a pipe, and then a little code for the source database, for example, GenBank in this case, a pipe, and the accession. What will happen in the future is that you will simply have the accession there and nothing else. So the GI is gone, the pipes are gone, it's much simpler, much more easy to parse. But the GIs aren't present. So that's what you're getting ready for, right, is flat files and FASTA records that don't have the GI numbers present. So I'm going to go back to the slides here and talk a little bit about what GIs are. So just to review what GIs are and why we've used them. So GIs are integers. They point to a particular version of a sequence record. And you'll find them in a variety of databases. So principally in Entrez, Nuke Core, Nuke EST, Nuke GSS, Protein, and PopSet all have records that are identified with GI numbers. This, of course, includes the GenBank database in its entirety and the RefSeq database in its entirety. All of those records also are assigned GI numbers. And any of those records on the web have a report called a revision history, which I'm showing here, and revision histories basically let you look at the history of the versions of a particular record. This record has an accession, DQ656054, but as you see here, it's had 2 GI numbers in its history. Because if a sequence record changes the sequence data, if the sequence data itself is updated, they're updated and the GI number will shift. So what's happened with this record, it came in 2006, there was one update, but the GI number didn't change. That's because the update wasn't to the sequence. It could have been to the author list, it could have been to an added publication, it could have been an editorial change or a new annotation, but the sequence itself didn't change. But the sequence did change in August of 2007. When that changes, the GI is updated to a new number, and the version of the accession is also incremented. So now we have DQ656054.2, second version, as opposed to DQ656054.1. So you can view this history for any record in any of these databases. Just go to the upper left and you can pull down the menu and get to the revision history report. So the point about accessions versus GIs is that accessions point to a particular version of a record if you include the version suffix, and the GI points to that same record. So a given record, a given version of a record has always had 2 identifiers, the GI number and the accession.version. So the DQ656054.1 points to that particular GI number. The updated record 656054.2 points to a different GI. Let's say that in the future that record is updated again. What would happen? Could we predict what would happen? From the accession number, yes, we can predict because it'll be the same accession, but it will be .3 now, so the version increments again. But we have no way of knowing what the GI number will be. Effectively, it will simply be a pseudo-random number from a user's point of view as to what that actual identifier would be. The final point to make about the accessions versus the GIs is a bare accession without the version. Well, what does that refer to? It's a really good question because that accession number currently actually points to 2 different versions. In Entrez, if you do a search with the bare accession, you'll get the most recent version at the time of your search. But if you do the search today and 6 months later, the record is updated to .3 and you do the search again, you'll now get a different sequence back. All right. So again, accession.versions are better to use than accessions because they point to specific versions just as GIs do. So that's basically where we are in terms of accession numbers versus GI numbers. Why are we changing? A number of reasons. One of the reasons is we have 2 systems, GI numbers and accessions, and that's not as good as having one consistent system. So we're trying to move to one system of identifiers, which would be the accession.version. Accession.versions are more predictable. In other words, when they get updated, you know what that's going to be. You're going to increment the version suffix, the accession will stay the same. And they're more human readable. They have strings in them, letters at the beginning that can give you some information about the type of sequence, and we have a lot more variety of things we can use as accessions. So that's one other reason to prefer them. They're better able to handle the large variety of sequence data that we have coming in and the amount of that data coming in. And another reason why we prefer accessions.version at this point is that at this point in time, there are already a large number of sequence records that do not have GI numbers assigned to them and never will. For example, WGS contigs, none of those have GI numbers. TSA contigs, None of those have GI numbers, but all of them have accessions.version. So a WGS accession is a long affair. It has 4 letters at the beginning and then a series of numbers and then a version suffix. TSA accessions are very similar. So all of our sequence records throughout NCBI can be represented currently with an accession number .version, but only a subset by a GI. So that's another reason why we're moving towards accession.versions as the central and unifying identifier. So what is the time frame of when all these things are happening? I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, but just to crystallize it, we had our initial announcement in March. We had a blog post that came out on our NCBI Insights blog just a few days ago, and we're doing a webinar now. We'll continue to do more of these webinars and more blog posts over the coming weeks and months as developments occur with these changes. We are currently continuing to work on many of the ramifications of these, and you'll hear about these over time. So this is just the beginning of a series of things that we'll be letting the community know about what will be happening with these. In September, again, GIs will be disappearing from default sequence record views, so FASTA and flat files, the default views. You'll still be able to, we understand right now, to have a downloadable option to get FASTA and flat file views that contain GI numbers, but they won't be default. And finally, in March of next year, the GIs will not be available at all in sequence record views. So what will break? All right, so what will these changes actually, what consequences will these changes have to a typical user? The main issue is to think about any process that you have that parses GI numbers from flat files or from FASTA. So if you are using those data records as a source to get GI numbers out, those processes will break because the GI numbers will simply not be there anymore. So that's the primary thing to be concerned about at this point. And again, you have until March to really fix those processes and update them. But that's the most important thing to think about. Things that will not break. If you have a database that has GIs in it now, those GIs will continue to be used as retrieval engines for, or identifiers for records in NCBI. So any record that has a GI now will continue to have that GI, will continue to be retrievable by that GI indefinitely. Also, the GIs will continue to be in the XML and ASN1 presentations of sequence records. So if you're using the XML or the ASN1, nothing will change. Just flat files and FASTA. However, and this is a big however, more and more new sequences will not be assigned GIs, and it's not going to be predictable which sequences are going to get GIs and which ones won't. So if you only use GIs, the data that you will be able to access from NCBI will become more and more obsolete, or you'll get less and less newer sequences will actually be able to be represented in a database that only uses GIs. So again, moving to accession.version is going to be a plus for keeping up with the most current data. So our recommendations at this point in time, again, any process that parses GIs from flat files or FASTA really must be fixed as soon as possible, now preferably. So start working on those. Those are the biggest problem. Any process or database that depends on GIs, right, for indexing or for retrieval, should be updated to depend on accession.version instead. So we're recommending that you switch those primary keys away from GIs to accession.versions if you're using those in some way. And that should be done as soon as you can possibly do it. But again, the most critical thing is if you're parsing GIs out of those flat files or FASTA. All right, so there's a number of things that will be happening in addition. These are not all to the point that we can tell you specifically about them, but additional webinars, blog posts, announcements will cover these topics. But here are some things that we can generally expect in the future. In September, or around September, we expect a new parameter to be available for the e-utilities, and these are the Entree API. So the e-utilities that will allow them to accept accession.version as input and provide accession.version as output. So currently the e-utilities use GI numbers as their primary keys for retrieval of sequence data. That obviously is not going to be a great idea moving forward. So we will have an option to switch the mode in the e-utilities to use accession.version instead. The GI version will continue to be the default, and will continue to function for all sequence records that currently have GIs. But to access all of the data, you would need to use this new parameter to switch to the accession.version mode, if you will, of the eUtilities to access data. eDirect is a fairly recent package that allows you to use the eUtilities from the Unix command line. This is described in detail in the eUtilities documentation. I'm not going to go into that right now, but that will also be updated to handle accession.version input and output, and that should be also in a September timeframe. We understand that in many cases what these kinds of changes would mean is that you will need to convert GIs to accession.versions. We are planning to offer a new service, again around September, that would be able to do this in large batches. So, and by large I mean around 100,000 or more at a time. So if you do have a large set of GIs and you just want to switch them over to accession.version, we are going to have a service available for you to do that. In addition, we plan to have some FTP files that would have the entire set of GIs that would then associate the correct accession.version with that GI. Those are fairly large files. They'd be available by FTP. Finally, in September, we expect that a new version of the BLAST binaries will be coming out that will be using accession.version as opposed to GIs. And we'll have more to say about BLAST as events unfold. But those are some things that we're expecting to happen in the relatively near future around September. So how do you keep abreast of this? How do you keep in the know? Tell your friends and neighbors about things that are happening related to these changes. Please follow our blog. That's NCBI Insights. It's ncbi.nlm.nih.gov. There's links on our homepage. There's links in these presentation slides. The NCBI news site, our social media, the Facebook and Twitter accounts, all of these are again linked from the NCBI homepage. From the NCBI news page also. We will be announcing all of these changes on those platforms. So that's a great way of keeping track and keeping up to date of what's happening. We will be giving additional webinars, so watch out for those. Those will be on the Learn page. The URL is right there. And if you are interested in the APIs and the eUtilities, it's a great idea to sign up to Utilities Announce. And the link is there to where you can sign up to that mailing list. It's just a simple email list, but we do send out all of the detailed announcements about upcoming changes to the utilities there. And finally, if you do have questions about this that we haven't covered today, or if you have questions down the road, please feel free to write to info@ncbi, and we'll certainly be happy to address those questions. All right, so I'm going to take a break at this point, see if there's questions that we have to address.
So Eric, there's several questions basically about the eUtilities. There's a lot of people are concerned about, how are they going to work with the new accession.version format. So can you address that a little bit?
What we expect right now, and again, this is what I was talking about in terms of a new parameter that would be coming out for the eUtilities, is that the parameter at this point we believe will be called ID type, so ID TYPE. Parameter when it's set to a value of ACC, so you'd add an ID type equals ACK parameter to any eUtility URL that will convert the eUtility into a mode where it expects to receive accession.versions and where it will output accession.versions. So a couple of examples. In eSearch, for example, eSearch typically takes an entree query into like Nuke Core, Protein, one of those databases, and returns to you a list of GIs, all right? We don't want that. We want accession.versions. So if you were to add ID type equals ACK, what will happen is you do the same search using eSearch, the same term, but then what you'll get back in the XML will be accession.versions rather than the GI numbers. Similarly, in eFetch or eSummary, you would be able to provide accession.versions to the ID parameter. Now, in Fetch, just as a trick, you can do that now. So eFetch does take accession.versions in the ID parameter now, and it has for actually a few years, so you can get that support currently. eSummary does not. So eSummary only takes GIs currently, so eSummary would be changed so that if you use ID type equals ACK, eSummary would be able to take accession.versions and give you back the docsum XML for those records. And then finally for eLink, we would expect that eLink would be able to take the accession.versions, and then if you're linking into a database, for example, linking from nucleotide to protein, or from genome to protein, or from PubMed to NuCore, the output of eLink would be in accession.version rather than GI. So those are our expectations. That's being worked on right now, and we expect that to be available publicly sometime in the September timeframe.
There are a few other questions, Eric, that are sort of asking about whether we're going to have FASTA files available for testing with the def lines that are without the GI numbers in them, and also sort of about like when will people be expecting FASTA files on the FTP site to change to the new format?
Good question. So in terms of the availability of test files, that is on our agenda to provide. We expect to be able to provide some sample GenBank flat files for nucleotide and protein, as well as FASTA files in the near future. So keep abreast of the announcements, and we'll announce where those are coming. I would point you again, if you would like to just take a look in that news article that I showed earlier. It does have examples of the places in the flat files in FASTA where the GIs are currently and where they will not be, all right, in the new data format. So even though it's not a full record, it would give you a bit of an idea about what to expect. But we will be putting some sample data out so that you can test with that. In terms of other presentation formats that are not directly from Entrez, for example, like FTP files, the GenBank releases, RefSeq releases, the returns that you would get from the utilities, these kinds of questions. We expect that all of these data formats, if they're flat files or FASTA, will again not have the GI numbers after March of 2017. So that's the drop dead date. After that point, you will not see GI numbers in any of the releases of RefSeq, GenBank, any of the other sequence FTP files that we have, nor any of the returns from the utilities or Entrez. Beginning in September, we will begin to remove the GIs from default presentations. The first priority with that is going to be on the web and Entrez presentations. So that's the first thing that would very likely happen. I'm not going to be able to give you a date right now about when those changes will happen in GenBank and RefSeq releases, except that it will happen by March of 2017.
I think those are the general topics. There is an interesting one that I don't know the answer to for sure. We've simplified the def line in another way besides removing just the GI number. The abbreviation for the database in FASTA def line has gone away. Now, I assume that's largely just to make things simpler, although one person in the question spot is concerned about that because they find it makes it easier to understand the feature table format.
Yes, thanks for the question. It is true that the current proposal is to remove the GB or the ref moniker there that would let you know what the source database was. At this point, one of the driving forces for the simplification is many other third-party software applications and other processes accept a very simple def line with a one identifier more easily. That's one of the things that we're trying to respond to. But I'll take that under advisement if there's interest in having some indication about the source database. That has come up in some discussions. One thing I would say is that in many cases you can determine from the accession number format what the source database is. So the presence of an underscore in the accession is a dead ringer that it's a RefSeq, and that's pretty much a universal rule. Without underscores, it's almost certainly going to be an INSDC sequence, GenBank, EMBL, DDBJ. You can also determine TSA WGS sequences by the fact that there are 4 alpha characters in the beginning of the accession. So there are some rules that you can use. It may be that we want to publicize those and tabulate those a little bit more clearly so that people can see those and use them to determine sources. All right, well, I'll thank everyone for your attention and for attending today. And again, please write to us if you have additional questions in the meantime. Thank you very much.